Welcome to the Code with Jason meetup. Tonight we're doing another mentorship session with our friend Yen. Welcome, Yen. So this is session
Oh,
number two. Um, and Yen, before we started recording, we were talking a little bit about the book Code Complete, which I had recommended earlier. Is there anything else in particular you wanted to talk about in our session today?
I think maybe kind of pertaining to some things that I'd read in Code Complete, it was talking about loose coupling of your
Hmm.
application. And something that we're currently learning in school is we're learning about APIs with Rails.
Mm-hmm.
And you have your services, you have your facades, you have your poros, you have all of those things. And one of the things that we're doing currently, I don't know if this is going to change, but we're creating a facade object that we use inside of our views, and we're calling on methods in there to interact with everything else. And I wasn't sure if that followed the loose coupling concept, if that makes sense.
Okay. Uh-huh. Yeah, we can talk about that. And actually, before we dive in too much, for anybody who didn't see the last session, Yen, could you just briefly introduce yourself, where you live, what your situation is, and all that stuff?
Right. Yeah. So my name is Yen. I am an Army veteran. I am a stay-at-home mom for 8 years. I'm hoping to break into tech, so I'm attending a coding boot camp, and it's a 7-month long program that focuses on Ruby and Ruby on Rails with the back end focus. And oh yeah, I'm in Arizona.
Yeah, all right. Um, okay. So yeah, maybe just because I was already thinking about it, we could talk about Code Complete a little bit. So this book, which I have here, Code Complete, is one of the books that I recommend to people when they're first getting started. For a long time, I didn't really have one single go-to book that I would recommend, but then I read this, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago. I didn't read the whole thing. I like skimmed through parts of it 3 or 4 years ago. And the author, Steve McConnell, his thoughts really resonate with me. He seems like a really smart guy. And so, and this book has kind of a high level approach. It's not something super specific like a book about SQL and databases or something like that. It's more high level. And so I like to recommend this one to beginners. And Yen, you had asked like what in the book specifically, because it is quite a long book. It is over 800 pages. So let me just, I didn't do any prep because we just started talking about this just now and I pulled my book off the shelf here. But let me skim through the table of contents here. Yen, you mentioned the construction metaphor. And that reminded me of something kind of interesting. Um, I started reading this other book that I think is really good called Modern Software Architecture by Dave Farley. He's somebody else who I really respect. Um, and he kind of clued me into a different metaphor for coding because, like, a lot of time we think of coding as building, but that book made me realize that writing code is an act of design. And like if you think of a factory, like an automotive factory, for example, the programmers aren't analogous to like the factory workers who are building the cars. We're analogous to the people who are like designing the factory and the machinery in the factory that builds the cars. And then like when you actually run the code, running the code is analogous to running the factory, and like loading an individual web page, for example, is analogous to producing one instance of a product, like one single car or something like that. I thought that was an interesting analogy, but that's not discussed in Code Complete. He uses this other construction metaphor.
Right.
Oh, variables. Yeah, I don't remember the specifics of what was said in the variable part, but I think that's a good one to focus on. Did you happen to get a chance to skim over that part yet?
No, I didn't. I actually was just kind of in the beginning reading all of the parts that we're talking about, the prerequisites of when you're making your construction and things like that. I'd actually read like 30 pages of it, and then I was like, I should probably skim, like you said.
Yeah, because it'll take a long time to read all 800 some pages.
Yeah,
Um,
when you have it in a
mhm.
ebook format, you don't realize how big it is. I like until you pulled it off of your shelf, I was like,
Ah,
oh, that's huge.
yeah, it really is. Yeah, I'm just flipping through the variable name section. Um, it's crazy how many times I come across somebody's variable names and they're just like inscrutable or inconsistent or whatever. I think he might have some examples here if I can find some real quick. Oh, he just has some naming conventions for different languages and stuff like that. Um, but one thing I'll say about variables is I think people abbreviate too much. Like something that frustrates me big time is like seeing an abbreviation for password and people type it PASSWD. And it's like, thanks a lot for saving me two characters. But now I have to like guess, if there's a password, I could have guessed that the variable is called password, like completely spelled out. I could have guessed that, but I never would have guessed it as PASSWD. Um, and so like having, okay, abbreviations can introduce like mysterious inconsistencies and violate what they call the principle of least astonishment. So I think it's a good idea to completely spell those out. Um, Amber's asking, do you mind sharing the name of the boot camp?
Oh yeah. The boot camp that I attend is Turing School of Software and Design. It's it's a lot longer of a boot camp than most ones that you see. They're usually about 14, 12 weeks. And I enjoy that it's focusing on back end instead of how they always say full stack, right? So we dive in pretty deep into concepts and things, much more than the past ones. So I have a question
Yeah.
concerning variables and variable names. At
Hmm.
what point, I guess, is it too long? Would you just say don't ever abbreviate? You know, and just thinking back to one of our first projects in the first when we were first learning about just pure Ruby, one of our projects was a linked list. It was like a beatbox where we made our terminal play beatbox sounds. And I just remember that that's where I really learned like, hey, I have to be really specific with my variable names
Hmm.
because you have these nodes that you're attaching. And I would just get so confused because I just named my node, current node, and next node. And it was just all like
Hmm.
node was just all over my screen. I was just so
Yeah.
confused.
Yeah, I don't think there's any such thing as a name that's too long. But I think when a variable name starts to get really long, like if you have one that's like 5 words strung together, then maybe that's a clue. Um, because variable names can be scoped inside of classes. Like if you have a program that is not structured in an object-oriented way and you just have like a whole bunch of code in one file, for example, um, you'll have to like prefix all your variables. You'll have to include the entire scope in every variable so that you understand what that variable means. And so you
Right.
might have repetition among your variables. Um, I wish I could think of an example offhand, but I can't. Um, I don't know, maybe like in a scheduling app, you might have a bunch of variables that are prefixed with like appointment or something like that. Sometimes that's a clue that this is a concept hidden in the code that hasn't been identified yet. And maybe you could say, okay, I see all these variables that are prefixed with appointment and it's making these variable names really long. Maybe that's a clue that I should extract this concept of an appointment and encapsulate all these appointment related values in the appointment. And then all your variables that were previously named appointment such and such can just get the appointment prefix dropped because now they're in this appointment class, there's scope to an appointment. So it's obvious that we're talking about an appointment, and then everything can get a little bit easier to read.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Hmm. Okay. Any other questions or thoughts on variable names before we move on to other stuff?
No, but just to confirm, you were just saying like if you see that a variable name is coming up too often, try to abstract those and encapsulate it in something else, like a class.
Yeah, maybe. Like it could be a
Okay.
clue that there's some
Right.
concept
Could be a clue.
hidden there. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Um, I vaguely remember. Oh yeah, this whole section. Um, part two of the book is called Creating High Quality Code. Um, there's a chapter in here called Working Classes. So it seems to be talking about like good characteristics of classes. I think that's a good thing to, that's a good section. Oh, high quality routines. In other words, high quality functions. I recall that that's a good one. I think I could stand to reskim this myself because it's been a long time since I've looked at it. And then I see actually I was only in like the, oh, I was in the contents at a glance section. So there's an entire part of the book consisting of multiple chapters just talking about variables. So that kind of underscores how important variables are. Let's see. Sorry, I'm still just paging through here. I know that's what I can come up with off the top of my head. But I'll try to take a closer look again, and maybe next time we talk, I can have some more specific ideas for you.
Yeah, that'll be a good place for me to start just looking and skimming over those areas versus trying to read the entire thing.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So you had asked another question near the beginning, but I forgot what it was. Does anybody
I think.
remember?
Oh, it was the concept of loose coupling and
Oh
how
yeah.
currently, I don't know if it's the right way we're doing it, but how we have facades and we're encapsulating and we're putting our services in our facade and our poros in our facade and calling it that way. And it didn't seem like it was quite loose coupling, I suppose.
Okay. So at like a really high level, um, do you feel like you have kind of an understanding of what the benefits of loose coupling are?
It seemed like, from what I read and what I remember, it seemed like the benefit was that if your code is loosely coupled, then it doesn't rely too much on something else. Because I think it was giving an example of like a cog and a wheel, and it was trying to get the diameter of a wheel. So it was creating the wheel class within the method.
Hmm.
And it was just kind of like you don't need to know what the object is, you just kind of need to know the information or something
Okay.
like that. Maybe I'm misunderstanding it.
Well, here's how maybe I would characterize it. Um, with loose coupling, if two things are loosely coupled, then you don't need to understand both things in order to understand each one individually. Like when two things are entangled with one another, then you kind of have to understand both in order to understand either. So that
Right.
impediment to understanding makes things more costly. Um, and also it makes things harder to change. Like if two things are entangled, then changing just one of them makes everything more difficult because they're interdependent. Whereas if they're separate and more loosely coupled, then you can change one without having to worry about the other.
Right.
Um, maybe a real world example. I think I got this from Modern Software Engineering by Dave Farley, but there's an example of like a car. Like it'd be ideal if you can swap out the engine of the car for a different kind of engine, without having to, for example, change how the steering works. And it's definitely like a very practical day-to-day concern. Like just earlier today, I was working with a client who has a really big tight coupling problem in his application. There are things that, in hindsight, should not have been tied together that have been tied together. And now business needs have changed, and there are these new potential customers who want the product to work differently. Um, and if the architecture of the application had been more loosely coupled, then this change would be relatively easy. But because things are tightly coupled, it's a really big deal to make this change. So basically, they have to say no to all these customers who want to use the product because it's not easy enough to change the product to have this different behavior.
So, in a way, we kind of talked and touched on microservices.
Mm.
Is it kind of like that in a way, where like if you have your, um, I guess, application divided into microservices, right? You can use them kind of in different parts of the services that you're offering. You can use them together.
Yeah, I think that's the idea. I personally have never used microservices because, frankly, I think it's not the right architecture for the vast majority of applications because of all the overhead that it introduces.
Hmm.
Um, I think this is a bit of a guess, but I think a lot of engineering organizations say, oh, our monolith is a total mess. So let's break it up into microservices so we can have it be more modular and we can have independent teams and stuff like that. But I think what ends up happening is instead of having a monolith, which is a mess, now they have several messy microservices and a giant mess, and things are even
Mhm.
worse. Again, that's a bit of a guess. But I
Okay.
think that's at least the hoped for outcome with microservices is that you can have this modular architecture where things are independent. But that's more of like a mechanical loose coupling. But there's also like conceptual loose coupling where like a lot of times I come across applications where like the concepts in the application are fairly muddy and the boundaries between ideas are fairly blurry. But if you can make the concepts in the application more distinct and crisp and say, okay, this is this, that's that, these are two distinct things, and they might talk to each other in certain ways, but they're separate things. That's much better, of course, than a situation where everything's muddy and intertwined.
Okay. So then I think a concept that we've been talking about a lot in school and trying to implement is like a single responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
So is that like what you're saying, how it can get a bit muddy, but if we follow the single responsibility principle, then it's kind of like whatever we're doing, make sure it has that one single responsibility so it doesn't get muddled, too muddled. Sounds
Yeah,
like that's what
yeah, I
you're
definitely think
trying to.
that's relevant. Um, Let me think. Yeah, like a lot of this stuff, it really starts at the business level, and at the level of like designing the product. Um, Something that it took me a really long time to realize is that good code is downstream of clear thinking. And quite frankly, a lot of products lack clear thinking. Like, no offense, Zoom, but Zoom, like, I find a lot of parts of it quite convoluted. Like using the video call part of it, like that's all fine. But if you ever want to go into the settings, it's like good luck figuring out what you need to do. It's all quite muddy. Um, and I think they could have like sliced up those concepts into ways that made more sense. Um, and because the UI is the way it is, and all the settings are like it's like nonsense, like there's no organization or structure to it. I imagine the code has to be a confusing mess because the code can't be any better than the UI. Like the UI sets the upper limit.
That makes
Um,
sense. Yeah.
yeah. So that's definitely relevant. Regarding the single responsibility principle, um, something that confused me for a long time is like, what is a single responsibility? Like, how does that get decided? And at one point, I realized that singleness is arbitrary. Like, it could be a super tiny, fine grained thing, or it could be like, I don't know, is a car a single thing, or is it a whole bunch of things? Like, it's both, is just how you decide it. Like, you could have in your application, you can have a concept of a car, you can have a concept of a transmission system, you can have a concept of a wheel. I don't know. Um, but like you can slice these things up in arbitrary ways. And whether a concept or a class or whatever is a single responsibility, I think has to do with the level of abstraction. Like if it's at really a really high level of abstraction, like a car, for example, then it's appropriate for the class to speak in terms of like really high level concepts. But if you're talking about something really fine grained, you're getting into the individual nuts and bolts and little pieces of the car, that would be inappropriate in the car class. And then now it's like, okay, this car class is talking about all these little details. This doesn't feel like a single thing anymore. This feels like we're cramming a whole bunch of stuff into this. But the main point I want to convey is that singleness is an arbitrary choice.
Yeah, that makes sense. I wrote that down. Single is arbitrary because you're right. You can break things down into so many different things.
Hmm. What
Okay,
else?
then so then I would assume that the way that we've been calling the information that we're receiving from our APIs and putting it in a facade seems like it might be okay since we have a facade that handles certain thing, even though it's calling our service inside of it.
Okay, yeah, I want to understand that a little bit better. Okay, so you
Mm,
have an application that's consuming an
right.
API. Is it like some third-party API or is it an API that,
Yeah, whether it's API that we've made or consuming a third-party API. So the process that we usually go through is we will have our a service folder, right, in our application
okay,
where we focus on the requests that we're making. We're using Faraday, and so we'll put things like where you're describing your connection. We'll make a method for a connection, and then we'll make a method to parse the data that we retrieve, and we'll make a method for getting, the URL basically.
okay,
And then from there, we go and we create a facade. I have a facade class. And in that facade class, you are um, you're making that service call and you're turning it into an object with a Poro. Like,
okay.
say currently I'm calling on a movies API to get a list of movies. So then my services handles the part where it's getting this data from the URLs, the API. And then my facade handles the responsibility of maybe calling that data and then turning it into a movie portal.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. In fact, I was working on that exact kind of thing today. Um, there is this third-party API that I needed to call. And the API would return a list of um, mobile devices. Um, it would return a list of mobile devices, but this API like many third-party APIs, totally sucks. And the format of the data that it gives is just nasty. Um, and so I don't want to have to deal with that nastiness every time I get a list of, I'm going to say phones, every time I get a list of phones. Um, and so I created what apparently you would call a facade object. I haven't used that term in this way before, but that makes sense to me to call it that. I've encountered the facade pattern for different applications of the pattern, but um, I created a facade object so that I can say, get me this list of phones from the API, but I don't want this raw, nasty format. I want these poros, plain old Ruby objects, each of which represents a phone, and then I can do whatever I want with it. But the API of these poros that I've created is a nice and tidy API rather than the nastiness of this third party API.
Right.
Yeah, so those sound like sound decisions to me.
Okay. Just wanted to check on that. I think I was getting too deeply into whether something was tightly coupled or loosely coupled. I guess I'm still trying to understand that concept.
Oh, okay. So yeah, let's come back to that and talk about how it might apply to this situation here. Um, I could imagine a situation where okay, so you can think of maybe like three layers. There's the API, that's one layer. There's the transformation of the API data to the poros, that's another layer. And then there's what you might call the business logic, where you do whatever you need to do with that data that you've gotten from the API. I could imagine a scenario where you have the business logic, and inside the business logic, it does the API calls, and the format transformation is tangled up inside the business logic, and so it's not separate, it's just all interwoven. And so then it makes it like harder to think about, like the way it is now, you have the HTTP requests, all the network related stuff, that's in one place. So when you want to think
Right.
about that, you can think about that by itself. You have the business logic, which I don't know, let's assume that the business logic only talks to the poros and it uses
Mhm.
the nice tidy poro API. It doesn't know anything about the network requests or anything like that.
Right.
So when you want to think about the business logic, you can think about that by itself. And then the facade objects deal with the transformation. And so when you want to think about that, you can think about that by itself. And if you want to change any one of these areas, it's at least mentally easier because you don't have to bring these other concerns into the picture when you're modifying one. So that's how I would interpret, hmm, that's how I would tie in the idea of loose coupling with this project you're working.
Right. Right. Having those three different layers.
Yeah, but significantly like the layers serving the purpose of making things easier to understand and change.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
Great.
All right. What else?
Um, let's see. Um, Along those lines, so maybe this part will get a little murky,
Okay.
going back to how just the way that we're building things in with facade. Something that we are following is the MVC architecture,
Mm-hmm.
and we're trying not to make MVC infractions, and we are learning to try and keep our controllers as lean as possible. Um, and a way that we've been doing that is kind of just shoving params information into our facade when we're
Mm,
initializing it.
okay.
And I'm just wondering, like, seems like you're shoving something into something else just so you can have a lean controller. That makes sense.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with you.
How do you feel
Um,
about that? And what's a better way to deal with that? I said,
I think it's a lazy cop out. Um, and I'll explain why I think that and what could be done instead. So, um, when you have parameters that are passed from one place to another place, that is like a contact point between the two things. You could maybe think of it as like an opening from one world to another world. Um, and if you're just passing params, it's like you're saying, okay, we have this huge chunk of stuff. You just take it and do some stuff with it. And the problem with that is that from the client perspective, um, in this scenario, the controller is the client of whatever object it's calling. From the client perspective, it's a total mystery what is being done with these params. Um, and for all I know, as the client, the the object that I'm calling needs everything I'm giving it. It needs everything in the params. And for all I know, it's touching all the params and doing something with all the params. And so, in order to understand this piece of code, for all I know, I need to understand everything that's going on in the params. And that increases the mental burden of understanding the code. But then it may be that this facade object that's being called only actually needs like two of those values. Um, and so a better scenario in that case would be just pass the facade object those two values it needs. And that way, when I look at the code from the controller perspective, I can see, okay, we're passing just these two values. That's all that I need to worry about. And it lowers the mental burden to being able to understand that code. This ties back too to loose coupling. If you're passing all those params to the facade object, that's tighter coupling because these two pieces of code are more interrelated. And in order to understand one, you need to understand both. But the less you pass, the more loosely coupled these two things are.
I'm seeing a kind of trend here. It seems to be like maybe less is more almost.
Well, yeah, if you think again about these contact points, the less talking to each other that things do, the easier things will be to understand in isolation and to change in isolation.
Okay, great. That makes sense.
Hmm.
Let's see, what else could I, okay, could I ask you some testing questions then
Yeah.
with the way that we're testing things?
Okay.
Um, how would I go about, is it okay to create a method in your test spec to kind of iterate over things? So for example, with this API, if I'm calling a bunch of movies and I want to check to make sure that this movie object has certain attributes or values
Mhm.
within this table that I have for this these movie objects. Um, but some of these values are nil,
Okay.
so they're not present, so I can't quite check for it. So what I did was I created a method like attributes that will go and it'll put the attribute that I want and say, hey, if this attribute is nil, then expect this. If it's not nil, then expect it to be this.
Mm.
because there were like six attributes that could possibly be nil, but they weren't always, if that makes sense.
Okay. Okay. Well, I'll make a comment, but I'm not sure if I understand the scenario very well yet.
Okay.
So I'll make a comment that I can at least say for sure, and then maybe we can dig in deeper. Um,
Okay.
I think of tests as executable specifications. And one thing that's desirable of specifications is for them to be easy to understand. And the more static the specifications are, the easier they'll be to understand. Um, so if there are like conditionals in the specifications,
Mm,
that can make the specifications harder to understand because you open up the test file and you see, okay, it does this and it does this. Oh, wait a second. I see under this condition we want this, under this condition we want
right.
this. I prefer to have it like just spelled out statically as multiple test cases rather than doing it, rather than having like actual executable conditionals in the test code.
So maybe what you're saying is, because what I'm doing is I'm using WebMock and VCR, so it's
Hmm.
making a real call. So what you're saying is maybe I should create, instead of using VCR, create fixtures for WebMock and mock that instead so I can have static values to check.
Hmm. I don't know. We're maybe getting back to the part that I don't understand. So can you help me
Oh, okay.
understand for this area of tests, what is being tested? Maybe like starting with like the highest level.
Yeah, yeah. So for this test, it's I'm testing the index page for maybe movies or something. And in within that index page, I'm expecting there to be a table, and I'm expecting it to have table headers. And I'm expecting each row of that table to have information about the movie, like the name, city, and state.
Okay.
Or no, like the name of the movie, the director, and the actors, or something like that. And so I'm trying to test that all those things exist, but since I'm making a real API call, I'm getting like maybe 30 results, right? And so
Okay.
I'm like, how do I test those results? Because they're each going to be different. Do I fill the entire test with like, oh, hey, this movie's going to be this, the director's going to be this? Like, do I have 30 rows of that?
Good question. Um, okay. So I think that this application that you're working on, the testing that's going to be required for it, it's not like kindergarten or elementary school level. It's like PhD level testing or something more toward that into the spectrum. These are like not easy things to test. And so, first of all, if you find it difficult, it's not you, it's just because this is actually a hard thing. Um, and there are a number of parts to it. So this part that you're talking about, the page that has the table and then it lists details about the movies, those are tests that I actually tend not to write because they're kind of
Mm.
tautological. Like if anybody's not familiar with the concept of a tautology, it's when you say something that like could never not it's like circular. It's like I like pizza because it tastes good. It's like, well, okay, that's kind of just saying the same thing in two different ways. Um, and with displaying the details of a movie on the page, it's like you're kind of testing, is the code I wrote the code I wrote? Which it obviously it's going to be. It never can't be. Like there's such little room to mess something up. There's not really any behavior there because all you're doing is displaying
Mm.
some information. So I tend not to write those tests.
Okay.
Um, and this whole
So to
thing,
clarify,
yeah.
sorry, to clarify, maybe focus more on testing behavior, not what's being displayed.
Yeah, well, I'll put it this way. It's like the less behavior there is in what you're testing, the less benefit there is to testing it.
Mm,
Um, I'm trying to think of like some other example. Okay, I'm coming up with this on the fly, so if I fail to if this doesn't work out, sorry in advance. But an example I use sometimes is like testing a car after it's been manufactured. So I could check to see if the car has a battery and if it has wheels and if it has brakes and so on. Um, but that doesn't really test much. Instead, it'd be better for me to actually try to turn the car on. And if it
hmm
fires up, then I know it has a battery because the car couldn't start without a battery. I'll see if the car can drive. I don't check to see if the car has an engine. I check to see if the car can
Right,
drive because if it can drive, then it has an engine. Um,
right. Okay, that makes sense.
yeah, so I focus on that higher level stuff. Um, okay. I'm struggling to explain this in a way that's like clear and not more confusing than it needs to be. So you can have these high level tests that exercise like a whole a whole sequence of events that leads up to some outcome. And if you do that, then you know that everything in between works. But sometimes there can be like a lot of possible execution paths and a lot of different possible scenarios. And you don't want to go through everything. Like, I don't know. Um, what if you want to test the car under different conditions? Oh, let's say this. You want to test the wipers. Uh, do the wipers work well in heavy rain? Do they work well when it's super cold outside and they're like frozen and stuff? Um, whatever. Maybe you don't want to involve the whole entire car when you just want to do tests on the wipers. Like maybe you just want to have some place in the factory where there's like a windshield and there's the wipers and you're just testing the wipers in
Mhm.
isolation. Um, that's a scenario where it makes sense to drop down to a finer grain and say, okay, we don't need this entire car in order to just test the wipers. And that would be like wasteful and cumbersome and all that to do it that way. We're going to have the separate thing where we just have the windshield and the wipers and we can test that by itself.
hmm
So I think maybe that was the thought, like if somebody instructed you to write tests for just this view. But
hmm
that's almost analogous to like testing the windshield. It's like, okay, we have this windshield by itself. Can I like look through the windshield? Okay, great, the windshield works. It's like that's not really accomplishing much.
Right. Okay.
So that's that part of it. Are they having I don't know how much of this is like somebody's instructing you to do these things versus you're making the choices on your own, but like are they having you write tests for like the facade objects and the API calls and stuff like that also?
Yeah. Um, our boot camp focuses a lot on TDD.
Hmm.
And so it's along the way, it's kind of less hand holding, and it's like you decide yourself, but they'll give us like a user story. I think you referred to it as something else last time. Maybe it was like
Mm.
a feature or something. So
Yeah.
they'll give us a user story or whatever to follow, and we will create our tests for it. But they told us, yes, you have to create tests for your services, your poros, your facades.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. And that stuff is like actually pretty hard. I came across this scenario with one of my clients a few weeks ago where somebody had written a test for an API call and they were like stubbing the API call. So it was like a fake pre-canned response. It was just
Mhm.
sitting in a
Like
file
a
in the
fix with a
test suite.
fixture.
It was in this case it happened to be a VCR response.
Oh, okay.
Um, and then in the test, they were just testing that the VCR response had the expected values. But it's like
Right.
these values are just coming from your hard drive, like nothing is being accomplished here. It was one of those tautological tests.
Right.
Um, and this confused me a lot early on. Like, how can you test API interaction when you can't hit the actual API? What I realized was that you can't test the API interaction itself, the network calls. You can only test the behavior of getting your request ready to send and the behavior of what you do with the response that you get. The analogy that I use in this is like, let's say you're a I hope I get this analogy right, but let's say you're a baseball pitcher and you're practicing and you can't control what the batter does. So the batter is the external API in this case, but you can control how you respond to certain situations. Um, maybe I want to say you can't control the opposing team at all, but you can say when somebody tries to steal third base, then I don't pitch. I throw the ball to. I hate these things. I don't throw the pitch normally. I throw the ball to the third baseman in that scenario when somebody's trying to steal third. Under the condition when everything's normal, nobody's trying to steal a base, then I throw the ball. These tests are just when I have the ball in my possession, and it's about what I do under different conditions, and it's not involving any response from the opposing team. And then I can do the other end of it, like if the batter hits the ball straight at me, then I catch it. Or if the batter hits it out of the park, then I just stand there and don't do anything.
Right.
But I can't involve the opposing team. Yeah, this analogy is maybe not the most fully baked analogy in the world, but hopefully it kind of makes sense.
So, in relation to this, and you're saying you're testing the behavior of, so if I was testing my services, right? And to test the behavior of my services, I wouldn't test the return values. I would test and make sure under different circumstances
You
that the
wouldn't test the
connection is
return
made.
values, you would test what you do with the return values. And more precisely, you would test what you do with the responses. So, like, if you, let's say, for example, your scenarios could be for a 200 response, I do
Mhm.
such and such. For a 500 response, when something goes wrong, assert that we display a graceful error message or something like that.
Mm.
Or for a 422 unprocessable entity response, we show a different kind of graceful error message.
Okay.
In those scenarios, the response that you're working with would be pre-canned. You might you might use VCR or something, or you could just hand code your own response. So it's like, okay, here in my test is this pre-canned 200 response. We assert that when we get this, then things are just normal in whatever way. Here's my pre-canned 500 response, and assert that when we get that, we show the graceful error message, etc. The network doesn't come into the picture at all. All you have is these fake responses, but you're not testing the responses themselves. You're only testing what you
Right.
do with the responses.
Okay. So then if we're just going back and circling back to it, so then in that case, it's kind of like, hey, if it's a successful response, then, you know, everything's good. If it's, I would test. yeah, so I would test for like the responses of it and then what I put or what I define that I'm going to be doing with those responses. So,
Exactly.
yeah, so like if it's I guess it's kind of like what we call edge case testing. It's like, hey, if things don't all go well all the time, like what can go wrong and test that.
Yeah. Yeah. The only asterisk I would put on that is like when dealing with third-party APIs or even your own APIs, I don't know if I'd consider these error scenarios edge cases because it happens. It's not a one in a million thing where you get a 500
Right,
or a 400 or something.
right. Okay. I guess we call those sad paths.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, because I currently the way that I'm testing is I'm testing when it's a successful response, right? I'm testing the data, I'm testing all the values that I want back, making sure that it has this key and that key. But what you're saying is that's not quite as important as what I'm doing with it, with that data that comes back.
Yeah, and in fact, like if you have this like fake pre-canned response, which is the only thing you can do because you can't get the real one from the network in your test environment, um,
Hmm.
then that accomplishes literally nothing at all because it's like I have
Right.
this thing of mine, this other thing of mine, and do they match up? It's like, yeah, they're always going to match up. They couldn't not.
Yeah, you're just writing your thing. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. All right, thank you. I
Hmm.
think that will save me a lot of time writing out those lines.
Okay, great. Yeah, it looks like we're about at time here, but I really appreciate this. You ask really good, thoughtful questions, and I think these benefit not just you, but a lot of the people present in the meeting and people watching on YouTube later and stuff like that. So you're doing a valuable service.
Oh, I hope so.
Um, okay, before we hop off, I want to share that a lot of this kind of work is what I do for consulting. I do specialize in TDD coaching. Um, and if anybody's interested in learning more about that, you can go to codewithjason.com and I have more information there and you can apply to be a client. And sometimes that involves training teams and helping people with questions just like these ones, like, hey, how do I test API interaction? We might actually look at code and do that. Um, or it can be like working with the CTO or VP of engineering on like, how do I put together a testing strategy so that I, as the CTO, can help my team be successful in testing and stuff like that. That's also work that I do. Again, you can go to codewithjason.com to find info about that. Thanks again, Yen. Thanks everybody for joining me, and I'll see you guys next time.
Thanks so much, Jason.